Yeah, Souza.
So they hanged Haman on the gallows, and that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. So Haman is dead, but disaster still looms. We read in verse 10 that the king's fury subsided. And as we get into chapter 8, you'll see that the king thinks everything is solved. Because the king's anger subsided with the execution of Haman, it tells us something about the concerns of the king. He really has no problem with genocide. He's not angry because Haman plotted to kill the Jews, even if they were the queen's people. He's angry because Haman has dishonored him in front of his people. Haman convinced the king to pass a law that made the king look bad. And Haman has caused him, as Eastern cultures put it, to lose face. The king's pride has been injured. But Haman's execution solved all that, so the king's good. Ironically, it was Haman's pride that drove him to attempt to destroy the Jews. Haman was truly the poster child for Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before the fall. So Esther is going to go before the king again. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So there are a number of reversals here, a number of peripeties, if you remember that word. You want to remember that word. Esther is given the estate of Haman. And in Persian law, that was allowed in cases of treason. The king could give it the estate of the accused man to whomever he wished. So he gives it to Esther. Mordecai is given Haman's position with the king. And Esther gives him oversight over Haman's vast estate. So Mordecai has gone from Persia's most wanted man to the second most powerful person in the entire empire. It's a stunning reversal. And then Esther goes before the king. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman and son of Hammedatha the Agagite devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? So she's pleading with him. This isn't a polite entreaty. This is an intense, insistent entreaty. And it's a 4-part request. And once again, we see that Esther was very clever. If it pleases the king, and he's already extended the scepter, so it likely does. If he regards me with favor, and he does. If he is pleased with me, and he is. And if he thinks it the right thing to do, which he can easily be manipulated into believing it is, let a counteracting law be written. Notice she doesn't appeal to his sense of justice or his sense of right and wrong. If the king believes genocide is wrong, he hasn't shown it. He has no such scruples. She appeals to his self-interest and to his love for her. Like I said, it's clever. But here's the kicker. How can I bear to watch my people and my family die? Essentially, Esther is saying, if you love me, If you really love me and want me to be happy, you'll do this for me, Xerxes Poo. Truly, there is nothing new under the sun. Women still, oh yeah. Trust me. Few tears, and you're just like, okay, so yeah, whatever. Just stop crying. So, don't ask me how I know. Here's the king's response. King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estates to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So I like picturing this scene for several reasons. The first one is that it reminds me of my college boyfriend. He used to say to me frequently these words in French. Je vous aime. Je vous adore. Doesn't it sound romantic? No. It's beautiful. I like you. I love you. What more do you want?
I don't trust French.
So yeah, he wasn't really proclaiming that. So Xerxes is basically saying, I killed Haman. I gave you all his stuff. What more do you want? And I think he sees in Esther's face that even if his anger is satisfied, Esther is not satisfied with what has been done. So he comes up with this idea of another law. Because the first law was irrevocable, right? And you could say it irrevocable. I just prefer irrevocable. So Xerxes can't just revoke an irrevocable law. So he agrees that they should write a law to counteract Haman's law, to go against Haman's law. But let me ask you this. Does Xerxes seem to have any more interest this time in what is written in the law? No. He's just like, okay, here's the ring. Go write your law. I'm fine with it. Seriously, will this guy ever learn? The definition of insanity, doing the same thing the same way and expecting different results? Yeah, I think we have plenty of evidence in scripture and in history that Xerxes was certifiably insane. He keeps doing the same thing, the same way, expecting different results. So the new edict is written. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and to protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month of the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses raced out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was also issued in the citadel of Souza. Does this sound familiar? It's just like the original law, right? It's a mirror image of the original law. The secretaries are summoned, just as they had been for Haman. The orders are sent to the satraps, the governors, the nobles, just as they had been for Haman. They were sent out to every people group and every language in the empire, but now the Jews are added. That's the only real difference. The law also mirrored Haman's edict. The Jews were allowed to defend themselves. However, the language intentionally mirrors Haman's law, what Haman wrote. In defending themselves, the Jews are given legal permission to, quote, destroy, kill, and annihilate, same as the first law, anyone who attacks them anywhere in the kingdom on the 13th of Adar. And then also allows them, as the original law did, to take plunder. To take plunder is also allowed. And it talks about women and children. Now look, the NIV and the ESV choose to interpret the Hebrew to say that they were given permission to kill anyone who attacks the Jews or Jewish women or children. But that's not the most natural reading of the Hebrew. The most natural reading of the Hebrew is that the law gives the Jews the right, gave the Jews the right to kill the women and children. So when you add to that fact, the fact that the law was intended intentionally to mirror Haman's law, and Haman's law gave permission to kill women and children. The vast majority of scholars believe the law permitted the Jews to kill women and children as well as men. Now listen, I understand that that's troubling, and we'll talk about it. Can't say I'm going to answer you so you go, okay, I'm good, like, Xerxes, but we'll talk about it. For now, let me just say that because the law allowed it, it doesn't mean they carried it out. As we will see, the law also allowed the Jews to plunder their enemies, but they did not do that. So in effect, the law written by Mordecai legalized civil war for a day in the Persian Empire. Kind of hard to fathom, isn't it? So we see more reversals going on here, more peripeties. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. Purple is a royal color. And the city of Souza held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating, and many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. So Mordecai, who once was clothed in sackcloth at the reading of the first edict, is now celebrating the new one. And the Jews who were mourning and weeping and fasting at the reading of the first edict are now celebrating and feasting. The day finally arrives in the first part of chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Souza, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed, and there's 10 names there, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. So this is something, this is the Jews experience a reversal of fortune. And they get help from the leaders, the satraps, I'm sorry, I turned the thing. The outcome is settled, is given to us even before we start reading. It says the tables were turned. So before reporting on the conflict, the author tells us how the whole thing turned out. On that day, the tables were turned, which is a saying which means that something unexpected happened. The person you thought was going to lose actually wins. The Jews experience a reversal of fortune, and they get help from the leaders. Now, listen, they weren't dummies. Mordecai, who wrote the law, was their boss. So they were afraid to fight for anyone else. But they were unlikely allies. The Jews had unlikely allies in them. The sons of Haman are killed, so there would be no one left to seek vengeance against Mordecai and Esther, or to carry on Haman's evil legacy. And then for the first time, we see that the first time, that it will be 3 times in total, but for the first time, the author mentions that they didn't take plunder. It was allowed by the law, but the Jews did not plunder their enemies. We'll talk about why. And so then Esther goes before the king yet again. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Souza, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Souza came together on the 14th day, the month of Adar, and they put to death in Souza 300 men, but they did not lay hands on the plunder. So this is both a report and a request. And there should be more. Oh, I didn't read this part, that's why. This part. The number of those slain in the citadel of Souza was reported to the king the same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Souza. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Souza permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. An edict was issued in Souza, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Souza came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Souza 300 men, so on top of the 500 before. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. So this is a report and a request. First, she reports that 500 men were killed in Souza, in the city. Now, only men are reported, so maybe only men were killed. But Esther's address is really different, isn't it? There's no, if you have favor with me, if it pleases you, if you don't mind. She just says, I want another day of killing in Souza.
Nice.
So there's much less flattery, and there's no reminder of his favor or his love for her. She gets straight to the point, which is a second day of killing in Souza, in the city, only in Souza. Why? Well, scholars have called this request anything from literal overkill to conduct unbecoming a woman. Is she just being vindictive now? Is she just wanting to kill as many people as possible? We can't really know what Esther's motivation was. But we do know that the Bible does not shy away from the darker sides of biblical characters. Think about Noah or Jacob or Solomon or Samson, for heaven's sake, or David. And on. We see both the good and bad character, both the good and bad motives and actions. That might be what's going on here. We can't know for sure. Perhaps Esther has tasted power and it has corrupted even her. We do know the second day is reported in part to tell us why Purim, the celebration of these events, is celebrated for 1 day in some places and for 2 in others. And then I'm not going to read verses 16 through 19, but it reports what happened in Souza, and plunder is mentioned for a 3rd time, that they did not take plunder. Now, we've talked about what it says and what it means. I want to take some time to talk about some kind of tough issues in this last part of Esther. The first one is this idea of retributive violence, this idea of killing everyone, destroying an entire people. And that concept is not only here in Esther, but it's all over the Old Testament. Not just killing men, but women and children as well. And this can make us squeamish sometimes. In fact, God commanded Saul through the prophet Samuel to kill every single Amalekite, man, woman, child, and animal. Saul disobeyed. He left Agag alive, and he kept some of the best animals for himself, which left Agag with the opportunity to father a child whose descendant was Haman. So in some sense, Saul's disobedience led to the evil that we read about in Esther. And we look at this, and it's so foreign to us that it troubles us. And sometimes we feel like we need to apologize for God. Well, God was really angry in the Old Testament, and he's a much nicer God now. And that was just their ancient culture. It was so regressive. We're much more progressive now. Listen, here's the thing. God, hear me on this. God does not need us to apologize for him. He is God, and we are not. Furthermore, he knows exactly what he's doing. And he knows as God that he has the right to do all of those things, all of which are within the confines of his perfect character. But we still think, how can this God that commands people to destroy their enemies be the same God who in the New Testament tells us to love our enemies? How does that make any sense? It only makes sense. In fact, the entire Old Testament only makes sense when we interpret it through the cross of Christ, which we're going to do in a minute. But first I need to tell you this. I need to tell you what's going on here. What's going on here is holy war. And that's a term that makes people squeamish. It makes us think of turbines and terrorists and fallen towers and car bombs. But this truly, the Old Testament is filled with this concept of holy war. Israel is waging war against its enemies. From the time the Israelites left Egypt, Israel's enemies were trying to destroy them, whether it be through actual warfare or by enticing them into their own sinful practices, which they did. God had to protect his people for his own redemptive purposes. If there was no people of God, then there would be no Messiah. The other thing we often don't take into account is the enormity of the evil of the enemies of Israel. Not only did they worship false gods, they weren't just worshiping false gods, but they practiced horrendous evil in the names of those gods. Ritual prostitution. Understand what that means? Women selling their bodies as part of worship, and men abusing it, calling it worship. Child sacrifice. Both were common. Parents literally sacrificing their children on an altar to appease a god. These were common practices among the enemies of Israel. These folks were not Ward and June Cleaver, and none of you get that reference, but trust me, it's funny. Ask your grandparents about Leave It to Beaver. It's an old TV show. The parents were Ward and June Cleaver, and they were squeaky clean. They weren't Mr. and Mrs. Brady. You understand that one. I don't know. And God knew that if Israel allowed its enemies to live among them, that those enemies would entice Israel into sin. And that's exactly what happened. Which is why they're in exile in the first place, because they devolved so far into pagan worship. So Israel's enemies were people so evil that destruction was the only remedy, because they were bent on destroying Israel. And God needed to preserve a remnant in order to preserve the line of Messiah. That's what redemptive history is all about. So let's talk about Esther's holy war. The mirror image of the law shows that the Jews and the author regarded this war as a holy war. And the fact that the Jews did not take plunder also shows that they regarded it as a holy war. Why? Because God forbade the taking of plunder of their enemies. Everything, just if you don't believe me, look in the back of your Bible, look at the name Achan and read what happened to him. But God commanded that everything they got, all the plunder they got, was to be destroyed as a sacrifice to God. So let's talk about the crux, the essence of holy war. This is a quote from Dr. Jobs. The essence of holy war in the Old Testament is not about two nations in warfare, one of which happens to be Israel. Holy war is about God warring against sin and evil on earth. His people were to live in the safety of holiness and righteousness. Their existence as God's redeemed people was threatened from the beginning by the rest of the world. Therefore, the success of God's plan of redemption required the protection of his people in his war against evil, which required that those people take both offensive and defensive measures to assure their existence. This in turn meant that holy war became necessary whenever their existence was threatened until in the fullness of time, Jesus, the ultimate divine warrior and king of Israel, was born from and for God's people. The true holy war has ceased. It's ended. Because Jesus fought its last battle on the cross. Holy war is all about God warring. I got to go back up again. I skipped something. A holy war was all about God warring against sin and evil on this earth. That's the crux of holy war, and it's interesting because that word crux is derived from the word cross, because it was on the cross that Jesus fought the final war against sin and evil. And it is only in this redemptive context that the holy war of the Old Testament makes sense. But as I said, holy war has ended. Jesus fought his last episode on the cross. He will return to banish sin and evil forever, but that victory was already won on the cross. And God's vengeance and wrath toward evil, including our own evil, my sin and your sin, was poured out on Christ and satisfied on the cross. As the song puts it, justice and mercy meet on the cross. So, in fact, Dr. Job says that it's no accident that the modern nations that still endorse the concept of holy war are nations that reject the gospel of Christ and the moral systems he commands. She says that holy war as it's practiced today is anything but holy. But we do have a continuing battle with sin. And we're told how to fight that battle. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's not against other people, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. We no longer fight against people. Our battle is against real but unseen evil forces in this world. Take courage. The battle is already won. Jesus fought that battle and won it on the cross and through the empty tomb. And our weapons in this battle come from the empowerment of the Spirit. Ephesians 6 tells us to put on righteousness and faith and the gospel of peace and other things. This battle is the battle for the human heart. And it includes our own personal battle against our own sin. It also includes the Great Commission to go and make disciples and win the hearts of others. But victory in these battles as well is only possible because of the cross of Christ and the empty tomb and the empowerment of the Spirit. When my nephew, who's now 24, was in Cubbies in Awana, he was trying to memorize a verse from the Old Testament that says, "There's none righteous, no, not one." That's the way it came out when he was 3. There is none. No, none. Now, I think Timmy pretty much got it right. My friend Chris puts it this way: we're all dirty, rotten sinners deserving hell. You've heard me say that before. I cribbed that. That's part of what makes God's grace so amazing. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus, our Lord. We are sinful creatures, and we cannot save ourselves. And we deserve death. God could have given us death. In fact, he could have destroyed the whole world and everyone in it, and he would have been perfectly in his right and in his character to do so. But he didn't. Instead, he wrote a counteracting decree in the form of his son. The bell's going to ring, but we're almost done. Just as Xerxes, king of Persia, could not simply rescind the first decree of death, God, king of the universe, cannot simply rescind the decree of death pronounced in the Garden of Eden against humanity. Instead, he issues a counter decree of life, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because God did not simply rescind the curse of death on humanity, his counteract decree of redemption necessarily resulted in the incarnation of his son and in that son's death on the cross. And this counter decree was initiated a long time ago when God chose for himself a people through whom he would achieve his purpose of redemption. Look, the Jews were no more holy than the pagans they lived around. And the truth is, neither are we. But God, in his mercy, set into motion the plan of redemption. When I first wrote this lecture many years ago, I wrote the lecture on Valentine's Day. And I had this thought: great, death and destruction on Valentine's Day. How is that appropriate? But then I realized something. I realized it's extraordinarily appropriate. Because all of it, everything in the New Testament, even the stuff that makes us squeamish, like Esther 8 and 9, points forward to these words. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Oh, there is no greater love. Amen? Thanks for sticking with me.